Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our monthly Center for Technical Development webinar. Just so I can make sure that we've got audio and screens working, if you can take a moment and type something into the questions box, good morning, hello, anything will work, just so I know that you guys are out there. Thank you. I appreciate those who actually take me literally. Awesome. Thank you. Great. So I also appreciate that you all know how now to ask questions when that comes up through the webinar. There's two ways today. At any time, you can either put a question into the questions box and we'll moderate those and answer them as they come up, or you might see a little hand icon. Obviously, everyone is on mute when you come in, otherwise we would have audio chaos. So we can unmute you. So at any point, if you would like to hit that hand and have yourself unmuted and ask your question. We will also have a sharing bit at the end of this. I would love to hear from folks near the end of our webinar today. So again, we'll use that same methodology. We're going to employ some polls and various things today. So you're going to have some things pop up to keep you engaged in our webinar and hopefully keep things rolling. One thing I do want to just allow everyone to know about, again, hopefully you found this webinar through our GovDelivery or our website. Just a reminder for any trainings coming up in the future for CTD, you go to our website under training events, CTD webinars and web training. You can find not only upcoming webinars, but you'll also be able to, right under that, find archives and recordings of all of our previous webinars that we've had since we've started this series this year. So a lot of things going on. I also want to say if there's a webinar that you want to hear about, or if you have a program or project you would like to share with your conservation district family, please let us know. You can literally put that into the questions box right now, and we will take all those. If you have a program or project you would like to share in our special sharing webinar series, please let us know. We'll contact you and follow up with that. You just have an idea for a webinar you would love to see the CTD put on in the future, please put that in there as well. We'll grab all those ideas and we'll start to make things happen. So thank you for that. Okay, well with that, I'm going to trade hats today. So talking to you so far has been Nicole Embertson from the Center for Technical Development. And I'm now going to trade hats. I'm going to even get my video going here. Say good morning to all of you, and I will also be your presenter today. So today we're going to talk about what I think is a pretty neat topic myself. It is something that I'm passionate about that falls within my actual area of expertise. Many of you probably know me through the CTD and through the work I get to do there, which I absolutely love, but I also am a research scientist. So what I do for my normal work, if you will, at the Whatcom Conservation District is I'm the science and planning coordinator there. And a few months ago, we had a great idea presented by a Conservation District employee who said, you know, I'm asked to do all this metrics tracking and this work, but I don't know how to do it or what it means or how to do the process or how to present this stuff in the end. And so we had this wonderful group discussion about this and put together this webinar idea and put together, all right, what do we want to talk about? What's the process? What would be meaningful for districts to hear? And the commission is just about to release, I'll share it today, some visualization for metrics and ways to do that. So this is a great way to put all those things together into a webinar and deliver that to you today. So I'm excited that I get to bring this to you. That I get to present this, and I hope that it's going to make a difference for you as you go forward and what you need to do in your own programs and processes at your district. So let's get started on how to choose and interpret metrics for tracking conservation outcomes. And I'll start this by saying most likely if you're here, you have had some interaction with metrics, whether that's been a scramble at the end of the year to pull together seemingly meaningless or disjointed numbers for a grant report. You've been asked by a partner, hey, how many miles of this or feet of that or this or that? And you're like, ooh, I don't know. Let me go try to pull that together and figure it out. Well, what if you actually took control of those metrics and made them work for you? What if you were ahead of them, not behind them? What if they actually have meaning to you? So let's visit what a metric is and how you can set up a process for success, for getting those metrics to work for you, not having them run who you are. So let's start today with a little bit of a roadmap. We're going to start with what are metrics? How do you establish those metrics? What metrics should you collect? Methods for tracking and assessing those metrics, functional ways to display those metrics, and questions and sharing at the end, as I mentioned. I would love to hear from those out there who perhaps have a process for this that's working really well for them. I have some great examples that I will be able to show today that for some districts who are doing this work already. So we've got some good success stories out there. So let's start with a simple definition of what are metrics. So first of all, metrics can be defined as a collection of measures used for assessing, comparing, and or tracking performance or quality of a process or product. They're not meaningless values that you throw in a report at the end of the year. They're actually functional, turns out. So they must be, however, well-defined. They've got to be reliable, meaningful, measurable, motivational, easy to understand and communicate. I'm going to come back to this a few times for a very good reason. And they set a baseline against which you can track progress. That can be progress of anything, but the point being, you can't manage what you don't measure. So really, metrics are something you can collect to create, assess, compare, track something, performance of a project, a program, an individual, whatever it may be. So there's three different areas, and I just wanted to call out these three things very specifically so that when we're talking about these, it makes sense to you. So a measure is something that's simple. It's a singular, unit-specific term for a number or a value. A measure, it's a single thing. It is a fence, a feet of something, a this, a singular individual thing counted. Whereas a metric is still a quantifiable measure used to track and assess the performance of a specific process over time. So this may be one or more measures makes up a metric. Don't worry, we'll come back to this. But it essentially, it can be a count of something, but it might be two things put together that's meaningful for you that creates a metric of success. So cost by something, or feet by, or number of something by something. So it's what we call a metric. Then we have something different, and I put this key performance indicator in here because while you are probably and should be tracking conservation metrics, you're probably also already tracking a lot of things that are internal performance measures. These can be things that relate more to staff time, to funds and money internally, to whatever it may be, whatever's coming in or out. And these are measures and metrics used to evaluate success of an organization or a particular activity program in which it is engaged. So it's taking things up a step. And we're going to come back to when this becomes a really valuable thing to measure. It is still a metric, but it's a very specific type of metric that we'll look at. So you can see an example here. We go from, let's say, number of BMPs installed to, let's say, percent of watershed covered by a BMP. We've taken two things together, and then we have taken that a bit further in this key performance indicator to say, is installation of that BMP meeting our conservation goals? So it's moving through this echelon of complexity where we're putting all these things together. So I want to start with a poll. I'm very curious out there for those who are possibly collecting metrics. So I'm going to launch a poll. So up on your screen, you should be able to see a question. Do you collect conservation metrics at your district? So I'm not asking if you collect money or time, but conservation metrics. So you're tracking BMPs, you're tracking something. So you can collect, I want to see a yes or a no. So it'd be great if you're able to click on either one of those. Hopefully that's up on your screen, and I can kind of see numbers coming in on my end. It looks like a lot of you are answering yes. I wonder if I'd put a few more words in there that said meaningful or useful, if the answers would have been a little different, right? So that is sometimes our challenge with this. So it looks like a lot of folks out there are saying yes, that you do collect some type of metrics. Awesome. Now, what I want to talk to you about and see what actually is meaningful about that, or your process by which you're doing that. And perhaps this is time to come back and say, are the metrics you're collecting getting where you need to go? And perhaps if they are, it's going to be the end of this presentation. How do you make those meaningful and interesting? That's going to be really reliable for you. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. We'll get back to the presentation. So here up now, I've got a process. So processes are really important for us to stay on track and to make sure that we're not missing anything when we're creating something. So each of these process steps we're going to go through individually on our route for how do we establish metrics, how do we present them and make them useful. Well, the first one is we need to establish a clear goal and objective. Followed by that is then choosing our metrics, creating a system by which we track and collect those metrics, building a formula for assessment of those metrics, knowing your audience to present that data in a relevant form, and then assessing your data on a regular basis to see, is it meeting that goal, or do we need to revise and start this loop all over? So while you're some metrics will be collected on long term, some are short term, some need to be revised often. So things might change over time. So each of these steps we'll go through. So let's start with number one. What is the process for establishing a clear goal and objective? And frankly, this is the most important part of this entire process. If you can get this right, if you can get this clear and established, the rest of this process is going to fall in line as far as what metrics you should probably track to assess that. So really starting here with some clarity and definitive purpose. So starting with, what is your question? And you've probably heard this a lot. We talk about this in things like effectiveness monitoring. We talk about it in any programmatic sense. What's the question? What are we trying to do? And this might be like, yeah, I get it. What's your question? I don't know, it's this. Well, stop, right? The question is so important, because if your question is this versus this, it can be even a word that could be different in your question, your metrics are going to be really different. So really focusing on what is your question and is it meaningful is really important. And this separates itself into two things, goals and objectives. And they're different, and I'm going to take a moment to clarify what those are, because inevitably, if I put up a poll and asked you, good chunk you would get it right, and a lot of us would probably be like, I don't know, one's kind of similar to the other, it's just all the same, right? I just make all these things and it happens. Not quite. So let's really think this through. A goal is a statement of desired outcome to be achieved over a longer time frame. So this is something big that we're talking about. An example would be like, we want to improve water quality in the watershed. That's a big goal. That could take years. That's a time frame. And then we've got an objective. And an objective is that specific actionable deliverable that are achieved in a short time frame. Objectives are the actions by which we reach our goal. Example would be something very specific to say, we're going to implement the cover crop practice on 10 high-risk fields in the watershed this year. So that objective hopefully gets you to the goal of improving water quality. Maybe your overarching question can be even bigger. So this is important for us to think these through, because those objectives are what starts getting us to discrete action items that create our metrics and where we're going to go forward. And a really important process here, and I actually highly recommend you put this up anytime you're creating a goal, a question, an assessment of anything, whether that's short and long range plans, programs, projects. Keep your goals SMART, meaning make sure they are specific. If they're not specific, you're going to have a really hard time tracking something. Make them measurable. Do not ask a question that requires a thought or a feeling as an answer. That's really hard to measure. Make them attainable. Don't put a question out there such as, we want to be this, or we're going to improve water quality in the watershed is one thing, but to say that we will get it from here to perfect to perfectly clean, that could be really hard. Make it relevant. So make sure that the questions you're asking are going to be relevant to your clientele, to your region, to your area, to whatever it may be. Granted, some internal questions may not work for external, but as long as they're relevant to the district. So don't ask questions that everyone's like, what the heck are they asking that for? Like, what are they doing over there? So it'll keep things tight, and we'll get back to that too. And then, of course, make sure they're timely. Make sure that you're setting a goal that can actually be achieved in a timely manner. Yes, you can have 30-year goals. Go for it. Have some ones that are a little bit more attainable too, kind of like a to-do list. If everything was really big and hard on your to-do list, you'll never look at the darn thing. Have small, measurable, timely things you can do as you go along, which would be objectives to reach your goal. So keep your process smart, which also brings us to how in the world do you determine what these questions and goals are? Where do these come from? Well, most likely they're going to come from these sources right here. Your long-range plan of work and your annual plan of work will probably and should dictate your overarching goals or questions, which would be that long-range plan of work. What are we trying to achieve as a district programmatically? And then your annual plan of work should hopefully show you those measurable outcomes of objectives. This is what we're doing this year. This is the goal this year. This is how we're getting there. And then that should help you achieve and find those metrics out of there. Perhaps it's a specific program or project that is saying, here is what we created as our goal, and this is for that project. It's a 1 year, it has a time frame, whatever it may be. You might have internal district performance goals. Those are those key performance indicators that are going to come back. So that could be really long term. That's something you track year over year over year for saying, are we profitable? Are we equitable? Are we making sense? Are we this? Are we that? Are we achieving certain things? And then you might have local or regional partner goals. You may have a regional objective for resiliency, for clean water, for climate change, for outreach, for food systems. Doesn't matter. If you are integrating in with that, you might be given a question or a goal by a partner that you are now tracking metrics to achieve. Most likely, you are doing all of these things, which makes things a little challenging, sure, but it also means let's find a way that these all relate to each other in some way. So if you are interacting with all of these and you have control over some of those questions or goals where others are being provided for you by partners or grantors or programs, how do you find overlap in the commonality of those questions and goals between your work areas so that you are more efficient and effective in tracking those metrics and reporting them on a larger scale? So I personally am all about efficiency, and this is part of that. So it's thinking through that, because efficiency will lead us to be more productive. It will lead us to actually be more purposeful in what we provide out, especially if you are a staff of 2 versus a staff of 30. That's going to be a really key part for you. So how will we know we ever reach those goals, those questions, those objectives? Well, clearly metrics. So our metrics will tell us that, which is why we have so many objectives with them on how to create them and how to make them good so we can assess those. And that's why you have to start with that question and be very clear about it so that you know what metrics to choose. They're very much linked together. So in our process, we're now on number 2 here. Let's choose those metrics by which you will assess your goals and your objectives to see if you're reaching them. So number 1 is stated, make sure your metrics collected will answer those goals. Do not collect things because they're interesting. Make sure you know the difference between a want and a need metric. You need metrics to answer a question. Those are things you need to collect. Just because you're interested or this stuff might be cool or, hey, let's just do this or that. There's one thing about forethought about we're likely going to need this, let's collect it, versus something that's onerous and you've added 27 more columns and now staff have 27 times more work and no one's going to do this because now you've made the process onerous. Keep it together. Keep it to the meaningful things that you need to have for metric tracking. And then when you are creating those metrics, make sure that they are this giant list. Once again, where you put SMART on the wall when you're thinking of your questions, put this list when you're thinking of how to create your metrics. every single one of these items is extremely important to consider when you're polling what metrics do we track. Make sure that they are well defined and consistent, meaning that a staff member knows exactly what you're asking them to collect. There's no, oh, what is this? Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. No, the moment you have a maybe, it's inconsistent and the metric is a little bit useless in that it's going to be different every time. Make sure it's measurable. We'll come back to this a couple times because that measurable part is the most important definition of a metric. In some way, it has to be measured so you can provide a value. Make sure it's reliable. Don't collect a metric that may or may not be around every year. Make sure that it's reliably collected. It's easy to collect. Granted, some things are not, and that's just a metric you have to collect. But overall, make sure it's easy and it's efficient and it's well distributed to staff. This is how to collect it so that you can remove any of those variables of, oh, it just takes so much time. I don't want to do it. And they won't. So make sure it's easy. Make sure it's meaningful. This comes back to that need versus want. Make sure what you choose is actually meaningful and you can do something with it. Relevant and timely, coming back to those. Make sure that those things that you're collecting make sense and that you can collect them in a timely manner and that the time frame you are collecting them within makes sense. And we'll talk about short-term versus long-term metrics. Make sure they're motivational, right? Like in the end, you're collecting all this stuff, great, but if you can't create a story with them in the end, make them motivational and interesting and easy to understand and communicate, you've lost the relevancy of collecting metrics to start with. So really keep them so that in the end you can do something great. And we'll come back to that one in our process to make sure your metric makes sense. So we've got two different types of metrics you can collect. And I really want to make sure you understand this because while one is better than the other can still be useful. So we've got quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative measures are what you're aiming for. These are things that are counted, measured, expressed in values and numbers. Pounds per this, acres of that, feet of this, gallons of that, right? Numbers of, etc. These are things that you can count and put into some type of spreadsheet for tracking. They're easy. Qualitative measures are descriptive, conceptual, they're observed. This is very challenging metrics and should probably just use internally. However, what you can do is create a quantitative value from a qualitative measure. An example of this, I'm sure every person on this webinar has been to a Google review or an Amazon review, whatever it is, there's a 5-star rating. It's a quantitative value created from a qualitative measure. I am saying, well, this product was this for me. I'm giving it a 3. Someone else is like a 5. Someone else is a 1. So it's taking a number of qualitative assessments and creating something quantitative. The challenge here is that the process for doing that sometimes is very challenging and it's not consistent. So it a little bit violates that other kind of thought process. However, sometimes it's what you really need. It's a more complex measure, which we'll also touch on here in a bit. So you can create a quantitative measure by a qualitative value. What you don't want to have in a spreadsheet is a feeling. So you don't want your, a measure of like, how well was this implemented? It's better to create a consistent process for a scoring versus saying pretty good, okay, not great, right? Those are things you don't want in a spreadsheet. How in the world are you going to create a value out of that? So be careful with that. And in the same vein, we talk about the accuracy of those metrics. So thinking through, yes, these metrics need to be measurable and quantifiable in some way. But as we just said, some metrics can't easily be counted or measured with very high accuracy. So we come down to the when is it okay to estimate? And granted, everyone here has estimated a metric at some point. Most commonly, I'm guessing it's the landowner contact estimate that many of us have to do. And so in some ways, we're saying, well, how do I assess the impact? When does that matter? So if we're saying, hey, how many landowners did we interact with this year? And I'm like, I don't know. I guess there was like an event and I this. And, do I count like my newsletter kind of went out to people? And just put like 200. It's good enough for me. Well, that's okay if all your district is trying to do is put out, we approximately this, or they're putting out a range. If that's their end reporting, we talked to between 500 and 1,000 people this year. That's fine. However, if your district is trying to put out a metric that is exact, to say like we talked to 207 people multiplied by this time means we spent $10,172 on outreach, don't give an estimate. You're really screwing up that end value. So make sure you know how that metric is going to be used in your analysis and your final reporting to know if it's okay to estimate it or not. Sometimes it is not okay to estimate. If this is a singular reporting value for, again, an organization that's compiling, a number from lots and lots of people and just trying to put out a vibe, right? Or just trying to put out a range, an estimate's going to be a little okay. But just know, whatever is estimated increases your error and decreases your accuracy of what's out the other end. So remember, how am I going to use it, and is it able to be estimated or not? So collecting metrics. We might have an awesome question. We might establish 27 metrics that we want to answer it. And then we get down to, what metrics do we already have? What do I need to collect? Does another organization have shareable data I can use? How often do I have to collect this data? What's the cost to collect the data? Do I have staff capacity and resources for collecting and inputting this data and analyzing it and showing it graphically? Again, a district of 2 or a district of 20 where you've got dedicated people for this might go back and adjust their question or their metric. Sometimes, again, you don't have a choice and you're dictated what those things are. But in this case, really think this through. And hopefully, you've been collecting things. Perhaps you have a lot of time up front to load up a database of metrics that you just haven't been collecting for a long time because you never had a process, and now you need to go forward with that. Versus, is there shareable data I can gather from someone else? What I will say about that, and even what you are collecting, watch the units, watch the context, watch how it was collected. Just because someone else has, acre feet of water or, let's say an average phosphorus value for their region, and you're like, oh, great, I'll just take theirs and put it in mine. Well, you're using totally different units, or the way that their method was used does not match yours. That data is not comparable. So if you are grabbing data from someone else or giving yours to them, make sure the units and or the methods come with it. Don't grab data that doesn't make any sense. And in the end, your values are like, wow, this seems really off. Why didn't this work? Double check when you bring in data. How was it collected? Where did it come from? Really, really important. Also think about the scale that you need the data. Don't collect data at the county or HUC 12 watershed when you have to report on an area or a sub-watershed. It's easier if you're going to be collecting scalable data, so you're collecting, let's say, GPS coordinates, to make them small, so that then if you're mapping this later, you can take it from an area out. It's much easier to sort it and report it by a sub-watershed when you're collecting it at a finer level. So if you have the choice, it's always good to collect a fine level, or just know what your scale is and stick to it. Units, as I mentioned, make sure that you've got these units. The cool part about units is if you're collecting them and logging them in an individual category, they can be converted. Acre feet can go to cubic yards or pounds or tons to this, and parts per million to something else. So you can really convert that if you're holding them and you're collecting them really well. Consider confidentiality of a measure or a combination of metrics. Sometimes one on its own is not a confidentiality issue, but you put two together and suddenly you do. So sometimes that's very valuable for collecting the data, but the reporting part is when that becomes important to think about. And consider metrics showing trade-offs or negative impacts of actions. So don't just collect metrics to make yourself look good. Think about, well, if we're trying to say we have a positive impact on water quality, or what's our impact on water quality, think about what is the negative metric that you probably should be collecting to also show that, if that applies. So very important to look at that as well, so that you can have a good assessment of what your metric means in the end. So now we think about short and long-term metrics. This will make a big difference for specific types of BMPs over others. So clearly a short term is there's an immediate impact of an action. For instance, let's say we installed manure storage collection. So it was a pile of manure on the dirt. We put a slab with a cover, put that manure in there. Bam, that's like immediate from day one to day two of construction impact. A long term will indicate the success of a program or a planning system over time. Let's say a riparian planting. That takes many, many years before you really see an impact of it. So really thinking about that short-term and long-term metrics, and more important, for those long-term projects, programs, or BMPs, create short-term metrics so that you can show progress along the way rather than waiting 5 years to collect a data point to see if it's different than where you started. So really think about that. For instance, again, a riparian planting. Well, we know it's going to take years before we can show our ultimate, goal of that. But this year we can say how many plants survived from year 1 to year 2. That's an easy one. We can then maybe year 2 to 3, are there changes to local ecosystem? Are we seeing more critters come into that space? And then maybe year 3 to 4, do we now see shading happening? And then maybe it's year 5 or 7 or 10 or 30, is there finally a benefit to fish habitat? So create those metrics in incremental years for a program or project that you know it's going to work like that. Some things like irrigation management are also similar. Number one, do we decrease water use? Bam, we can see that right off the bat, right? But do we make the farm more efficient? How about crop yield increase or decrease? That's going to take a year, maybe a couple years if the weather was a variable in there. We want some consistency of that data. And do we increase seasonal flow in that river? That's going to be a while yet before we can see that. And maybe a singular individual isn't going to make a difference. And so we're trying to bring more people into a program to see the impact of a program, not just the practice that was installed with that program. So thinking of those short-term and long-term metrics, and a lot of those also play into your, let's say, a short-term long-range plan and those goals and objectives that you're creating. And this is important then, return to a site to follow up. Even if it's a farm plan, right? Yeah, I wrote a farm plan this year. Bam, there's my metric. I can check that off the box. But is your farm plan effective? How do you know that? So perhaps it's doing your assessment year 1 to say, yep, wow, there's a resource concern here. And going back a year or 2 years later and doing that exact same resource assessment. Does it make an impact? Yes, no, maybe so. And this is where we move this to this simple to a complex metric. So it's easy to say, wrote a farm plan. Harder to say, was it effective? Did it accomplish that resource protection goal I was aiming for? So these are where we have a calculated score, can also be a metric. So this is many measures create a metric. So again, a count is a simple one. We can also have complex ones that are very meaningful. So this would be something I've done in assessments, as I just mentioned. This can be things like Comet Farm, SVAP, Soil Conditioning Index, P-Index, range condition score, et cetera, et cetera. All of us, if you're a planner, there's a million NRCS tools. Even if you're in outreach and anything else, it's the same thing. You're looking at, what was my impact on an outreach strategy? Wow, that's hard to say. That can take a really long time as well, right? You can say, well, I talked to 10 people, but for them to change their mind, to change their behaviors, to talk to their neighbors, that could take years. Frankly, we all know that can take generations sometimes. So perhaps you look at a complex value that's looking at perceptions and change that becomes a calculated score that is your metric that goes in there. Just make sure you have a very consistent process that any assessor can do at any time, anywhere. So make it consistent. So this is something, again, you want to create this calculated score or something. An index is usually what we'll call something like this, so that you can see changes over time. You can see, sure, the question was, how many BMPs did we install? But did the BMPs we installed get the impact we were looking for? Are we conserving natural resources? Sure, maybe you could take water samples everywhere, every day, every place to see about that water quality, but more likely it's going to be easier to have an index that says, yeah, there was a change in resource concern assessment on this landscape, therefore we are assuming an impact. Or we can use a scientific value to multiply against what we did to create an estimated, if you will, outcome on a reduction percent. So this is where you collect metrics and then use other values to make those meaningful down the line. So this is also where you have real data, if you will, real data. So this is measured values. This is where we're getting complex. You have water quality data, you have soil quality data. These aren't just, I installed a BMP, but these are very specific things. We can now multiply those against other metrics we've collected to do bigger things like loading, conservation, ecosystem impacts. These are to get to our really big questions. We're gonna have to have some type of a value that allows us to assess a percent difference or a numerical change or something, a change over time. Really important. So the type of data you are able to collect, whether it's simple or these complex metrics, will allow you to answer simple or complex questions. So really thinking that through as well. So, gosh, that was a lot, right? And I will take a little pause and see if there's any questions out there of anything I've talked about so far. But most likely you're thinking to yourself, great, Nicole, okay, so what metrics do I need to collect? Like, what in the world am I actually supposed to do? Well, I hate to tell you this, but it's going to be very variable. It's going to depend on your district, your community, your state, your grant, or your agency, your program. I can't tell you what metrics to collect, but I can tell you, and we're going to continue through this process of thinking it back through, what's your question? You know, that's what it's going to come down to, that you're going to have a question and many, many sets of metrics on how to get there. And all these metrics are going to play unto themselves on what that means. So I will just double check here. Any questions about any of the things I've talked about, accuracy, short-term, long-term, types of metrics, qualitative, quantitative, etc.?
We just have one comment in there, and I think this kind of speaks to what you're talking about right now, Nicole. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get some direct guidance on the metrics that we're collecting so that they can be combined for measuring the collective impact of our work?
Yes, it would be. And in fact, I believe you read one of my slides. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get to there because you are absolutely correct. It's one of our questions later on about, you know, how do we create a cohesive set that's very specific to programs? So that comes down to this piece about when we're thinking of these sets of metrics and we're thinking about, yeah, what in the world do I need to collect? It might be broad for reporting. It might be narrow for evaluation, short-term projects, long-term projects, internal metrics that you're tracking. Oh, it's a lot, right? You can have so many different things. There might be overlaps, as I mentioned earlier, that you're really trying to find. Where are those? Or those dictated measures of should all districts be collecting the same thing for specific programs? The answer is absolutely yes. Should that be provided to districts? It would be lovely if that happened. So yes, but also remember, by the way, some projects don't do metrics tracked. Be careful here that you don't collect a whole bunch of things that you don't need in the end for reporting. And granted, mostly we're going to be tracking metrics and there's a lot of usefulness to that, but just be aware of that. Don't get all gung-ho and you're like, we're going to track metrics for everything. And you get to a project and the reporting is just like, you know, something basic, and you spent 20 hours collecting metrics this time period and you didn't need them in the end. So make sure that your metrics are overlapping and there are programs that are using the same metrics that you can use between them, or find that, create that. So if you're collecting a metric for one program or project, see if it's useful in another one so that it can just roll over and you can utilize it to create a more valuable question for something that you already are working on. So really think about that too and how those marry up with each other. So let's move on to what is this system? So yeah, that's a lot of stuff we need to collect. How do I effectively put that in so I can get something back out of it? So this is where I want to ask folks. We've got another poll that I'm going to put up here. And I want to know if you have a unified system for collecting metrics at your data. Not I collected, they collected, she collected, he collected, I have a sheet, they have a sheet, we have a sheet. Do you have a unified system in your office that's easy to use, that's effective, that you can get into? That's my question for folks. And it looks like by and large, you guys are, thank you, your votes are coming in, It's a tight race. But it looks like by and large, the answer is about 60% no. And that's not surprising. We all do things a little bit different within our programs, within our projects, within our districts, within our regions. This is where I think I'm getting closer to the question that was just asked, or the comment that was established about, okay, so we collect metrics, but it's challenging. How do I do this effectively and efficiently within my district, or within my region, or within my state, etc.? So let's talk a little bit about that. So I will say the most important part of tracking metrics is setting it up first. So it's actually, before you track anything, don't have a bunch of data and be like, oh, we should create a database for that. Oops, because this person writes on a sheet of paper and that person puts it on a calendar and that person actually had a spreadsheet and da-da-da-da-da. Set up a unified system first. It's going to eliminate so much headache and time, and it's going to create consistency of what's collected. So do this first. There are a lot of ways to do this. Excel, Access Database, something like Smartsheet or Google Sheets actually has a form submittal that I highly recommend you utilize, such that if you have many people inputting data, you've got a form for a program or a project that says, I'm going to submit I just finished a farm plan, or I just finished a riparian planting, or I just finished an outreach event. I need to log my metrics from that activity. You open the form for that program, and there are all the things you have to input to submit that form. And that form then just takes your data and it goes into a spreadsheet somewhere that you have someone managing. You don't necessarily want everyone monkeying around in an Excel sheet that then when someone opens it and inputs something and they forget to save it right, and then someone else goes and puts something else in, and now, it's all in a wonky thing, or maybe it missed them, or they saved it somewhere else, something weird happened. That's the challenging. If you're a single individual and you've got Excel, great. Otherwise, try to find a way to do a database system or something, again, like Google Sheets. You can have multiple people inputting information to it online, because that's how it works. And that's a free service versus something like Smartsheet, which functions similarly, but is you have to have a license. It's a little bit more expensive. So really just thinking through, what is our system for tracking? Keep it simple, but keep it accessible. So anyone who needs to use it needs to have easy access to it. Think about that. Really, really important. Consider any grantor database you have to report to, but don't let it be your slave. In other words, if you're collecting environmental data or something else, you might also need to enter it into someone else's spreadsheet or into someone else's database, ecology or EPA or whoever it may be. So consider that first. Look at what they're asking you for so you can make sure that's in your tracking system. But don't let that dictate how you can effectively set something up for yourself. But it's a really good consideration. I historically have tried to create a database based on where I've got to put something else. And every time I've tried it, year after year after year, it never works, because the way they want the data is not the way I need to input the data. So just make sure that you create some efficiency getting it over there, but don't let it drive how you create something internally that works best for you and your team. And again, create consistent guidelines for this. Hence, that's why the form is really nice. It's very tight. This is exactly what I need. So where you put it, it goes where it needs to go. Otherwise, make sure that everyone knows exactly how to put things in there so that it's not all over the place and someone else misses a unit or, monkeys around here, put something there instead, right? So just make sure everyone knows how to use it. I know this sounds basic, but it is so important and valuable and doesn't happen nearly as enough as it should. Make the process simple. I can't advocate for that enough. If this is a super complex process, people won't do it. And so if it's simple, you need them to do it. And that's the most important part of metric tracking, because for most of us, this is not very much fun. There's a handful of us that love analytics and geek out on this, but most of you are just trying to get your work done. And so entering these metrics is kind of like pulling hair anyway, so you might as well make it simple. And lastly, assign a metrics data manager. So again, if you're a district of one, you are all these things, good for you. That makes it really easy. If you're a larger district, you have many people putting things in here, you really need someone who's paying attention every so often to make sure that it's all getting in there right. This is just a quality control measure, and someone then who can output information for you later on. So very important to just assign someone who's responsible for this database or databases in some way. Lastly, you want to really think about, you're collecting this data, but is it organized right? If you're in Excel or some other sheet-based program, do you want every program in one thing? Oh, maybe. If they're all the same metrics, probably not, because you're going to have different metrics. So maybe you've got a tab for all your different programs. Maybe a grant has one, but maybe they share columns. So you can do all this cool stuff if you want to learn about, take a tutorial about how to make different columns and data areas work together and kind of share data and et cetera, et cetera. You can make it pretty savvy if you want, or you can just copy and paste to another sheet if you're sharing a data point or a metric value. So that's really important to think about that. Or duration, you have long-term and short-term metrics. Maybe they're collected in different places. Just think about it early on. And again, there's no right format for setting this up. You have to do what works for you and your district and your system. Just make sure your metrics you're collecting are the same, but the way in which you organize it can be very unique to you and how your brain works, how your team works, whatever it may be. Just that's okay. Just remember that. Again, we can have a challenge when we have different metrics for different agencies. Sure, we have to acknowledge that and just do our best to highlight those things and make sure that they're reported out. And here's exactly, I said, wouldn't it be ideal to have a statewide baseline set of district metrics we all collect by program? Yes. So this is something that I think would be important to advocate for, that for the programs, let's say that the commission, which a lot of us are operating within specific commission programs, that we ask for what metrics. Instead of at the end, we have to do reporting metrics. Wouldn't it be fun if we had those metrics and a source to input those early on so that we had ownership and excitement and interest in those metrics as they're moving along? So there is a difference there. Instead of waiting to the end of the year to report them, collect them along the way and find out if they're interesting for you internally or for other programs or ways to do that. So again, if you have to do it, find a way to make it work and make it interesting to you as you're moving along. So our next step in all this.
Nicole, can I interrupt you real quick? We have a couple of questions on this topic in here. So there's been a couple of comments and questions if there could be a training on creating this said database system, and or do we have templates for databases that you know of out there? And then a related question, curious about what unified tracking systems are working best for districts that are doing it pretty well already. So kind of that all goes into like, is there a template or something we could look to for an example?
Sure, and I was going to show a couple of examples here coming up. So I'm happy to show, and in fact, I can show one of these right now in particular. So for instance, up on your screen, you'll see an example from that was supplied to me by someone who's working with EPA. So this is for an EPA grant that for non-point source tracking that was provided. They said, here you go, here's your Excel spreadsheet for the data and information that we need. So this is one with just generic information put into it that shows, okay, for this specific project, these are the metrics that need to be collected. And here's an example of what those look like in here. And it also provides a lot of things about, you know, exactly what are the units of measure that need to be collected for each of those parameters. And how do you, right? So it's a lot here. What are the processes for this? What is your, that is the actual reporting, clean one. What are the sum totals, et cetera. So something like this, if you don't have anything, is a great way. You might have a grantor that provides you a sheet like this, and you're like, this is great for this project, this grant. Here it is. Like, I just have to make sure I'm putting in the information that they need here, and they are answering whatever the grant question is or whatever those big objectives are. I'm just providing the metrics for them to do it. So this is one example of what something like that might look like. So this is something I can post up Again, it's just a template that's been provided by a singular agency on what something like that might look like. I'll show you another example here too. When you are creating something internal to ask questions, what things you want to think about when building a database, or when building, how do I collect this data, or what do I need to collect? So hopefully that helps a little bit. There aren't, like I said, there's some examples out there of these databases. I also know there's, it looks very similar for any program or any place. Palouse Conservation District uses Smartsheet for theirs, and they have a great way, again, of tracking this. They're using a form system, again, to collect from all the different folks working in a program to input that data right into that spreadsheet. Honestly, they're all going to look about like this. A spreadsheet for tracking metrics, again, should be really simple, and all it should say is, what are the metrics we need to collect? And that is your row, and then your data goes in there. So again, it's don't make it complicated. The hardest part here is choosing the metrics, not necessarily tracking the metrics. So the tracking part should just be, you've already thought through, we need HUC 12, we need the BMP, we need the unit of measure, we need the implementation date, we need the longitude and latitude. You've already determined what those metrics, then just make it simple. Just put the stuff in the spreadsheet. Keep it easy for yourself. The simpler a spreadsheet is, the easier it is to use later on. So really, really keep it simple on the data input. If anyone out there has ever had to do anything with statistical work or anything else, you know that you just want like values. You don't want color coding or anything fancy. It's so much easier just to have easy data that's consistent, that not everyone calls a BMP something different. Have drop downs, have very specific, this is what you call something, or put it in here. If you can create drop downs and all sorts of stuff within a spreadsheet that people have to choose something that goes in a cell, that's very smart as well. Again, so you don't have someone calling it cover crop and someone else calling it conservation cover crop or something of that value, right? You just want to make sure you have consistency of what goes in here, so it's all the same. Any other questions in that vein for tracking that I might have missed there, Jan?
No other questions on that. We did just have a comment that the Puget Sound Partnership has vital signs, progress measures, and common indicators they have and continue to establish to assess Puget Sound recovery, accountability for state agencies, and prioritize funding disbursement. Important for funding and programs to align, like Nicole says, so that we can use the same metrics across needs.
Yes, that's also a good one. So again, this is something where this is a very specific regional partner that's dictating. They've done this process already. They said, this is our question. These are the metrics we need in order to assess if we are meeting our goals and hitting our objectives throughout the year. So they're putting out, these are the metrics that we need. So once again, this is the system where you're provided the question, you're given what metrics and how they need to be collected, et cetera. Someone else has done this whole process we're talking about, which is why I want you to know the process so that you know when you're being asked a metric, it's going somewhere, it's doing something interesting. So if you're already collecting something for that agency, can you also use that for something else? So this is where I'm also trying to give you value for those things. And that sometimes it's really hard when you're just throwing, collecting metrics for someone and throwing it out there. Can you collect all the things that they're asking you for? So there's also oftentimes a capacity. So if you can't collect something because you don't have the funds, the means, et cetera, you can see, what is the value to that? Should, if what you're reporting is a little bit okay versus what you can't get through something. So it's important to, when you are not in control of the question or the metrics, to talk to that agency, that program, that partnership to say, this value is hard. Is there a surrogate, or is this meaningful, or can I still provide something else? So, also think through that when being dictated what to do. Or, you can also be so bold as if you're working with a program, project, or other partnership, ask them for a tracking sheet. A lot of people have this. They don't supply them because perhaps they assume you have something internally. So there are sometimes values there for just simply asking. The answer might be no, but at least you've tried. But what would be really hard is if you already have a system internally and someone else gives you a sheet and it is just wildly different and you're just having to orient yourself to it. Maybe it wasn't useful versus taking those metrics, putting them in your system and just tracking the metrics again very linearly and providing them back. So it's going to vary a little bit on the tracking system, which is why I always say it's good to establish something internally that works so that you're not having 7 different templates from all your different programs and projects, et cetera, but perhaps you're bringing those in together. So again, this is a part that takes a little bit of work and it's going to be individualistic. That part is actually really a little hard to dictate. Some of you have probably worked in a database system that collects information. Let's say the commission has one, and it can be really, really hard. You're like, oh, the access is hard. I can't get this. What is that value, right? So when you're trying to operate in someone else's system, it can be challenging as well. So it is nice when you can develop your consistency for how you're putting those measures in. So it's something that requires a little bit of thought. I hear that, but it's important. And one of the reasons, by the way, to create that tracking system or to operate within, if you are dictated something to operate within, is because it's likely set up to get something back out of it. So this is important to consider as well. That when we're analyzing metrics, you might have a lot. There might be just a lot of stuff there, and you're like, goodness, what do I do with all of this information? Well, this is one of those things too. When you're setting up that sheet, determine what you're going to have to do with it in the end, because it might help you also set up your tracking system such that, if you're asking for a complex measure out of the end, you want to make sure those cells are in the right order so that they're creating combined metrics along the way, or something else if you're creating something complex. You just want to know that ahead of time so you can create something on the back end that works for you. Also, what's your capacity and expertise? If you're a statistician, you might want to go, all out with your data. If you are like, I hate math and I hope Excel can do all this for me, consider that when you're creating that so that it's simple. So you can go all over versus, if we're trying to pull out just metric values, how many BMPs, do a count, done. Are we doing a calculation? In other words, what is, BMPs by landowner type? So now I just have to do a little like this times that. Or are we doing like all out statistics where we're saying, what is the change in time on X versus Y? Or what is the mean difference between something? Or are we having a significant influence or impact? Now we're going to have to add in some basic statistics. So your question is also going to dictate how you need to do calculations in here. Again, if your grantor is doing that, all you're doing is supplying metrics, great. But if you're trying to do something internally to assess your own performance or programs, you're trying to create metrics for your community, you want to think about this ahead of time. So some examples, as I mentioned, something very simple. How many numbers of BMPs did we implement? That's just a count. Do we increase carbon storage? Well, now we're looking at something that's a little bit more complicated, perhaps a difference in the time frame. So X over Y year over Z. Or do we have an impact of a BMP on a watershed? Now we're looking at something complex like multivariate statistics, looking at the effect of many variables on each other, right? So it's when you're thinking of what is your question, think about how you're going to get there, not just the metrics, but how you use the metrics together to answer that question. So this is actually, I've got a question for you guys because I want, and this is something to put in the questions box. What are the top 3 conservation BMPs installed by your district? And if this is okay, this is kind of like me taking a poll or a survey with you guys. The thing I want to know is you won't see a poll pop up because you can just type 3 things in the questions box. And knowing that even if there's 4 people on your district, you might all, on this webinar, you might all have a different answer, which is great. What I'm curious about here is what we're trying to do with this is take the top BMPs that are installed out there, conservation practices in particular, to create what metrics are valuable for you to then collect for those BMPs for reporting of different questions, for statewide questions that we should be asking that we can then say, okay, districts, we want to answer, this specific question for this BMP. Here's the metrics that are needed to do that. So if you can take a minute, and even as I keep going, you can keep typing those in. We're going to collect all that information. And we're trying to also, by the way, with that, create a conservation catalog. So a little bit of like a catalog directory to give to clients or to landowners or prospective buyers of land in rural areas about, hey, these are the top BMPs and how they affect things. And then perhaps for us then, what are those measures that we should really be looking at? So thank you for those. I see a lot of stuff coming in. I really appreciate that. And I love the fact that a lot of these are different, but I see a lot of similarities. And so I want to show you a little example while you continue to put those things into the questions box. So here are some examples of BMP metrics that you may collect, you may not. You may have a basics, but what happens when you add a little bit extra to them? So here's an example for you. For instance, something like nutrient management, acres of BMP applied to. That's probably what you're reporting. How many acres of nutrient management did you install this year? Well, is that valuable? I'm not so sure, but if you also had a metric of pounds per acre of nitrogen or phosphorus inputs reduced, or tons per acre change in crop yield because of nutrient management, or change in water quality at a specific location or region because of that, now you're answering some cool questions. Now you're getting somewhere when you just add a couple extra metrics to get to a question. Your grantor just wants to know, what are the acres of BMP applied this year? And you're like, oh, here's 27 acres or, 3,000 acres. Great. But what if you as a district also collected one other metric to answer a bigger question that you can report to your community or to a different organization or something larger? Livestock exclusion fencing, same thing. How many miles of fence did you install this year? Great, but is that meaningful? Perhaps not. But what if you said, we installed 300, feet or miles of fence, and this is how many acres of land that was protected. This is how many livestock were kept out of waterways and riparian or critical areas. Now that's a value that's cool, right? So thinking one step further, same with heavy use area. Number installed is probably, we did 7 heavy use areas. Well, what does that mean? What was the point? What did you preserve? Was it acres of adjacent landscape protected from those animals, or water quality or soil quality? So as you can see, these just go on and on. Irrigation water management, how many waters conserved? What was the crop yield change? Cover crops, acres of BMP installed, that's what we supply. But what if you also say, well, what's the cubic yards of reduction in soil loss, pounds of nitrogen uptake, pounds of additional crop yield that was supplied to that individual? Now we're getting somewhere. So you can see, even when we talk about farm plans or riparian plans, forestry plans, anything, I wrote 7 plans. Well, great. How long does it take you? What was the value in that? What was the number of BMPs implemented in those plans? What was the impact to conservation resources doing maybe one of those calculated values we talked about what was the resource concern ahead of time? What was it afterwards? What was your kind of qualitative and a quantitative value reduction over that time period? What was your time spent per plan? If now you want to change this into a key performance indicator internally to say, like, how much staff time is spent on these plans, and is it different between staff? And was that because of the number of BMPs installed, or the complexity of the place, or the longer someone spent on the plan, the better the water quality reduction was, right? Now you can take those 3 or 4 metrics and answer a lot of different questions. So this is why, we have basic metrics, but taking them a step further on answering those questions, just because you're reporting a singular value to an agency doesn't mean you can do something internally to provide greater interest and impact to that. So I want to show you an example here of what that might look like. So here's how what a spreadsheet would look like to answer different types of questions. So we start with simple, how many BMPs did we install this year? 10, great, okay. Way to report that. Here's, my annual reporting to somebody. Well, is that meaningful? So what if our question was not just how many did we install, but there we go. What if we said, what type of BMPs did we install and how many this year? Now we're breaking that 10 into 2 were heavy use and 4 were cover crop and so on. So now we've said these are the BMPs and how many we installed this year. So we've taken that a step further. And what if we said, well, you know, we have a bigger question here of what BMPs did we install with different operation types? So now we take that, those two heavy use, one was cattle and one was horse. And those cover crops, 3 were corn and 1 was potato, and so on. So now we've added a layer, which, as you can see, we break these things out. We have the same BMP value installed, but now we've added just one more extra thing to it, and we can answer a more complex question, a more detailed question. And we can even take that further to say, all right, so this is great, but what operation type do we spend the most time with installing BMP? So now we're doing an assessment of our outreach and our communication. And so now we're saying same, you know, BMPs and who it was with, but now how many hours to install that BMP. And if we want to say, take that even further and now create a key performance indicator internally, we can say, all right, well, that's how many hours we spent, but who was the individual in the office who worked with that person? So how much time does it take per individual to do that? So this is where now you've created a reporting value externally to do a local analysis to now change it into a key performance indicator. So you can see like, oh, look at this, like Jim and Jane both did a cover crop with corn, but wow, it takes Jim a lot longer. Like, why? And then I noticed, you know, same with the heavy use area. Well, it seems like, you know, it took Jim a lot longer than Jane to install a heavy use area. But if you didn't know one was a horse and one was a cattle operation, or maybe it was based on acres even, et cetera, right? So now you're really getting down to something more complex. And then lastly, we can even take that a bit further to say, you know, are the BMPs that we installed this year having a positive effect on surface water quality? Now we've created one of those water quality assessment scores, saying if 3 is no change, 5 is, you know, a lot, 1 is we had a negative impact. It's great to see that. And again, you can say, wow, why did this project have a negative impact on water quality? So it's hard. So now you can say, yes, our planning process or this, you know, BMP has a positive impact on water quality more so than a different one. Or occasionally we can have a negative impact because of this, or maybe it's that staff member who you're like, what are you doing out there? You spend a lot of time, you're not getting your quality impact scores. Do we need some training? Or are you confused about the process? Are you doing it differently than someone else? So you can use this as a quality assurance indicator. So, right, so I just want to show you an example of when you set this up, your question really impacts what you're like collecting here, right? And it increases, but then if you have a little bit more meaningful data, you can do more with it. You can answer these bigger questions. You can take it a step further. So this is both showing a reporting value, an internal community assessment that you would provide to a community or to a partner organization, and then something you would do internally. So taking it through those measures to metrics to key performance indicators, just so you can see the full spectrum there. So any questions about that at this point? And we'll kind of get in now to moving to how do we show these in a meaningful way now that we've collected all this information. What would that look like? And I do see, by the way, I just want to assure everyone that all of the sheets, examples I've shown today, plus this PowerPoint presentation will be posted with a recording of this webinar on the CPD website within about a day or two. Sometimes those recordings take time, but all of this info for you will be posted there, so you can use it as examples and go forward. So just to let everyone know that as well. Okay, any questions at this point? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we had one question in here. To develop SMART goals for BMPs, is it helpful to have a glossary of sorts, or how do you get everyone on the same page to have consistency year to year?
I'm not exactly sure what so the SMART goals piece, I guess means, I guess it just maybe would be easy if we chatted, but for the SMART goals part, what that is for you, the district, to create what are your goals for a program, what are your goals for a project, what are your overarching goals as a district, as an organization, and or what we said, maybe those goals those SMART goals, hopefully they were smart, are provided to you by an organization, by a grantor, by a project partner. So hopefully that makes sense. But those SMART goals, how you do that is you don't do it in a vacuum. If you work in a team in your office, so there's 4 riparian planners, or you're trying to actually bring all your metrics as a program together or as an office together, do that process together. Perhaps it's your board that creates that process and provides the district here. These are our overarching long-term questions that we've got, and the district creates the objectives on how to get to those goals. Perhaps maybe it's a process that's iterative. Maybe you are a team of 1, or you're the only person in your district who's been tasked to do this, and so you have the responsibility of creating SMART goals and objectives on your own. That could be it too. If that didn't answer your question, by the way, you can always raise your hand and we can pop you off mute if you want to ask more, or you can type in if that wasn't exactly the answer that you were looking for. Okay. Let me know, Jan, if a question or if a hand pops up, and I can stop and come back to that. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good for now.
Okay, great. And by the way, I will also say, folks, if at any time after this webinar you want to contact me direct, please do so. I'd be more than happy to talk through this process with you, maybe give you examples or ways to get to somewhere based on your specific need or example. I'm more than happy always to help you and assist you through this process. So my contact information will be at the end of the webinar, so just know that too. Okay, so in our last segment here, what I want to talk about is reporting. Yay, this is probably something all of you are interested about. So number 1, make it a meaningful result, right? Don't put out 10 BMPs if that's not meaningful, right? Like, what does 10 BMPs mean? Like, oh, good job, guys. Is that a lot? Is that a little? What does that mean? Does it have an impact? What the heck, right? So make sure that it's meaningful. Make sure it reflects those goals. And you can put your goal, like, this was our question, and here's the graphic, so when you're creating, what should we report? Go back to your question and say, well, our question was, do we have a water quality impact? So perhaps your metric you're reporting is, this was our impact to water quality, and this is how we got there. Here's all the different metrics that led to that. So come back to your question. That's, again, why it's so important to set that up tight at the front. Tight meaning smart. It is specific and it's easy. So, instead of having one question that's 7 different things, have 7 questions. That is the guidance I can give you, is that make sure that a question is a singular question. Provide context to the metric to convey its impact, kind of what I just said there. So give it context. Again, 10 BMPs, what is that? Well, you're like, oh, we did 10, cover crop BMPs, or 10 BMPs with livestock operations that conserved this or that did that. Oh, thank you. So when we looked at that spreadsheet, it was like maybe that middle box that said, oh, these were the BMPs and this was the measurable outcome of that. Oh, cool. Now people are interested in what you're doing. So again, is miles of stream, feet of fence, number of BMPs installed a meaningful metric on their own? No. But what if you brought it forth with miles of stream that improved fish habitat, feet of fence that protected waterways from manure, animal traffic, soil loss reduction, right? You're getting to that. And that part, we all, I think a lot of us start with that. Oh yeah, miles of stream that improve fish habitat. So we just go, we say, okay, hey, if you're lucky enough, GIS person or IGIS, oh, this is how many miles of stream we put CREP on this year. Boom, there's my metric. Really? Is that what you needed? Well, how did you prove that improved fish habitat? Did those miles of stream actually have that? What's the other metric that should have been incorporated with that? What was our change in our scoreable assessment to that waterway, our SVAP or something else, right? Give me a couple metrics to show that. Not just miles of stream and we assume something is happening. Measurable values. And lastly, when we're thinking of displaying that data, who is your audience, right? You got to start that from the beginning. And sometimes, again, in our process of going through setting this up, you might have this really cool way you're collecting data, et cetera. And then you go back to oh, hey, the audience is us, or the audience is the community, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe we don't need that, or it doesn't need to be this way, right? So all of these different audiences are going to want things displayed differently. You might actually have the exact same data set, but one is a singular infographic. One is a table of numbers, right? These folks are going to want your data differently. They want metrics reported, how they need to receive them, how their programs or their process works. So you can think of it as a graph, is it a GIS number, is it numbers, infographics, comparisons, pictures. Ooh, I'm going to show you some cool ones here in a minute. So whatever it is, think about your audience to know exactly how that should be put forward. And you don't have to be an outreach specialist to do that. We're going to show you some easy ways to put out cool things, even if that's not your expertise. But what you have to make sure is whatever system you created, by the way, with that data, that you can easily get things out of it. Hence what I said, make it simple so you can extract data out to create those different types. So you can have data go different places to create what you need it to do. Make it memorable. Make a graphic that people are like, oh, dang, wow, who knew? That's incredible. And then be consistent with how it's reported. That also went to some comments that were made about, well, wouldn't it be great if all districts reported the same thing in the same way at the same, level? Yes, the answer to that is yes. We should be a unified distribution of data and information and metrics. If we were all collecting the same thing, we can certainly all display it the same way when provided with the guidelines to do so. Which brings me to, how can we do that? So the commission has created a handful of really awesome resources. And I'm going to pull this up in a different way. And this is I think this is coming out very soon. Perhaps next week, the commission will be releasing this document that I've shown up here. And what they've done here is giving you ways to communicate numbers in visual representations, in that, that wow factor of things. For instance, if you're looking at 2.5 million acre feet of water conserved, someone's like, oh, okay, what is that? And you're like, that's the volume of Lake Washington. Wow, that's crazy. Or, soil mass and weight things. What is, 3,700 tons? That's the weight of the Space Needle. Really? That's crazy. So now I've got something in my brain that, not the number that the district impacts, but, oh yeah, it's like the weight of the Space Needle. I'll remember that. So, and this kind of goes on. They have this for length and distance measurements, land area measurements, some really cool things. The things that are hyperlinked in here, when you hit them, it gives you a unified graphic of that Space Needle that you can now use in your reporting. So you don't have to be a graphic whiz, you just use what's provided to you. So this is also really cool. Or clicking on here for, here we are, 5 to 6 tons is the weight of the average male orca. Bing, here you go. So you can say, how many tons, did you guys do this year? The weight of a male orca. You're like, wow, that's insane. That's a lot, right? So that's something that most people can relate to. They know what probably the size or weight of an orca is, but I don't know what 5 tons means. So pretty great. So you can find, this will be out soon. The commission will put out a notice when it's available. Great hyperlinks. Another really great thing, there are a lot of these digital images and graphics available for you. If you go to the commission's website and look under their marketing toolkit, if you have not explored this, by the way, I highly recommend. For yes, one thing, we need to create consistency in metrics tracked, and perhaps I'll receive a template, but now this is a way to express those things in a meaningful format that can be similar amongst all of us. Again, they give you a lot of stuff in here about colors and branding guidelines, media and events, messaging, outreach. Again, if you don't have a specialist in your office, this is a great, useful tool for you. Even if you do, assist your outreach folks in utilizing a lot of these materials so that they are consistent among districts. So when we report out to partners as a region or as a unified alliance in an area, it all looks very similar. We can all talk about how many male orcas. So there's 13 male orcas of soil conservation in, in Chelan County. Like, wow, that's incredible. Or within this region. And lastly, it's in this photo and graphics down here in graphics. you can get to this digital image library, and it's got all of these different images in here that you can utilize in those kind of infographic styles to create some meaningful output of the data that you've collected. Put it in a visual form that people are like, great, that's cool. I get that. This has meaning to me. So very easy. And again, this is where if the commission has put this out, all districts have free access to it, and we can all use the same thing. So please explore this resource and utilize that. Again, if you just go to the commission's website under Marketing Toolkit, you're going to find the majority of that, and that this document, I know it's still under review by the state CPO group, the Communication Partnership and Outreach, who created this with Laura Johnson at the commission. So you can thank all of them for creating this really great accessible resource that we can now all have this really neat way to exhibit and communicate our data to our partners, our communities, ourselves even. It's pretty neat. So hopefully a very helpful resource to you as you're moving through creating, how do I show this data? How do I communicate this to folks? And the last step in this, we've established a goal. We've created what those metrics are going to be. We've got a tracking system to capture them. We know how to assess them to create values. Now we know for our audience how to put those out in a cool, relevant way. The last thing we need to do now is assess that data. So we need to look at it. Did it actually meet our goals, our objectives, so on? Did we actually hit that? Yes, no? And use this now to then redo this whole circle. So if you're not meeting your goals, then perhaps you set them too high. Perhaps they're not right. Perhaps you didn't collect the right metric if you're not able to show your goal in the end. So it's great sometimes when creating that question, you've set a question, your metrics, you're creating a system, and you go back around to say, okay, well, the system I created and the way I'm going to put it out, answer that question. No. Okay. Do I need to reevaluate the question, or do I need to add a metric, or did I forget how to analyze it? Right. So go around this circle a couple times until you can say all these are like, yep, this feels good. So then even if you're being given information by a grantor, hey, we need these metrics, you're like, oh, okay. But see how they can work for you. See if they roll in the system. And again, you might discreetly only operate in one of these boxes in the circle, and that's okay too. You might be one of these, you might be all of these, you might be both. So just know that too, and have, for yourself to know, yes, I do all these things, I do part of these things, I do none of these things, whatever it may be. So the last question I want to ask, and I believe this was already asked or suggested, that if available, if it could be done, would you want a statewide metric tracking template for commission grants? So if that was available to you for, let's say it's livestock grants, shellfish grants, RCPP, whatever, irrigation, so on and so forth. Anytime that there's a program or grant that's provided for you, at least statewide or by the commission, that all districts are operating. We also all have our individual things we do, but those programs that we're all functioning within, would it be helpful for you to have a tracking template that might be useful to you? And I'm seeing by and large, there's a high response of yes, and that's information we can easily set forward to the commission as well. So at this point, I do want to see if there's any questions that are out there by folks. If you've got anything that you want to know about that I can cover, and or I would also love to hear if you have a metric system that works really well for you. I would love to see, if you've got an example or something else that you want to put forth and share with the group. You can either type it in, we can read it out. You can raise your hand if you want to talk about a methodology. As I mentioned, there's a couple of districts out there who are doing this really well for a few of their different projects that I'm aware of, and I bet there's more that I'm not aware of. So again, if you've got something that works for you, we'd love to see that. If you want to share anything at this point, in the last handful of minutes that we've got here, I would love to hear from folks. And I do see that there are a few other comments, by the way, that came in that I think are fair for me to reiterate on a couple of them regarding a statewide template. And I think the concerns that I see, the comments here, are very common. So whether people are asking, hey, we'd love a template, and then we get a lot of questions, well, we want a template if. Please don't make it rigid. Please don't make it stringent. Please don't make it complicated. Please don't make it overly exhaustive and onerous of all the things I'm supposed to collect and so on, right? So it comes back to you should track things internally so it's answering your questions. When you are asked by a grantor who has a specific set of questions, it's fair if they provide you, these are the metrics in the system by which we would like that tracked. Or it's just, hey, here's a program and every district can answer a different question within it. There's that too. So I think there's a conversation, and I'm not saying this is going to happen. I'm saying I'm opening up an opportunity for conversation here for tracking of metrics, establishment of metrics for those programs that we have overarching similarity to as districts might be useful for folks. And so, yeah, I'm definitely seeing like what folks would love to see is something that related to the BMPs to say, similar to what we just saw with here's a way to display metrics. What if we had, okay, for these BMPs that are, you know, the big ones across the state, here are the metrics that we should collect. And you can always do more, but here are the basic metrics and the methodology with which you should collect that so that if we want to do a statewide based reporting of, you know, cover crop installation or manure storage or nutrient management, we're all reporting similarly. So we can really show that to partners. I think everyone here knows that a big part of how we use these metrics is to communicate our impact to an area, to a resource, how that blends with partners, what are we doing with the funds that we are provided. It's a great way for us to provide metrics back to say this is meaningful. This is a meaningful outcome of what we have done with those things, what we are doing. And so that's what I've heard from most people across the state, what we would love to do with metrics as a whole, as a district family and coordination, perhaps what you do with them internally as well.
And Nicole, there was one question in here. It said, it seems challenging to set goals and objectives if you don't yet have the metrics to feed these. How do you recommend doing this meaningfully without the metrics to support?
Okay, so you're saying it's hard to set goals if you don't have metrics? So is that what that was? Can you read that to me one more time, Jan?
Yeah, that's what it was. It seems challenging to set goals and objectives if you don't have the metrics yet to feed these. How do you recommend doing this meaningfully without the metrics to support?
So I would say you have to start with your questions and goals, and then you establish the metrics. If the point is you have established a question or a goal that you can't collect metrics for, you need to go back and look at that goal. Maybe you just set something unachievable, unanswerable, too big. Try again. Set a different goal. Examine what you just asked for. Is it big and broad? Can you break it down into many things that are measurable? So the point being, if you're you have to start with those clear, objectionable, measurable, think of all those SMART values, specific questions, and then you set your metrics. You can't have a bunch of metrics and then ask a question with them. That's not very meaningful. You can always start with a question, collect metrics, and then create new questions. That's okay too, to say like, oh, actually, I wonder if this, I wonder if that. What I will come back to is don't ask, questions just because they're there. Like, stick to it. It is the hardest part of this entire cycle, is setting those clear, objectionable questions and being very specific to them and then staying the line to them. It's easy to get sidetracked, but it's okay once you start collecting metrics to ask more questions based on them. That's normal in the process of this. Just bring them back to like, okay, we can ask all these questions, but do we want to answer them do we want to collect more metrics? Where are we going with this? You can go overboard, right? So again, I'll always come back to be specific with those questions, stick to them, write them on the board, come back to them. if they're short term, your annual plan of work, maybe the metrics you collect one year inform or revise the questions you ask the next year. Maybe your overarching question, as I said, can take years to answer. You have many steps and goals along the way to get there. So these goals are very specific, and don't make them onerous. Don't make them big. Don't make them off, junction. So get them reviewed by someone else too, if you can. Like, does this seem meaningful? Right? So again, it's that questions part is the hardest part of this process, and it will dictate your metrics. But in the whole process, we said, if you ask a question you can't collect metrics for, you need to review that question. So those two things, you might go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth until they make sense and they're things you can do. Any other questions we've got out there?
I don't see any other questions, but we did have a comment for Lake Whatcom. We report square feet of land treated with LID removes X number of pounds phosphorus equals the number of pounds of algae reduced. So it makes a very tangible impact.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where you're collecting a metric and then using a scientific value. So like exactly pounds of algae reduced. So we're saying if this, then that. That's pretty great. So we reduce this many pounds of nitrogen or phosphorus based on this evaluation. We can assume this, and then that's the outcome. That's a great way. So that's like, again, a metric. You're like, well, we can't collect pounds of algae reduced. Like, I don't have the capacity for that. You can use the scientific value that is an if-then statement that someone else has done that work or provided that value that you can reference. So that might actually answer the previous comment or question too in metrics. We've got this big question, but we don't have the capacity to collect all this really fine data or to assess and collect the actual soil loss from every single place we put cover crops. You don't have to. You can, again, use that calculated resource assessment value. You can use a scientific research value that says, the installation of cover crops reduces soil loss by 20%. So now you've got an estimated value. Just make sure when you report it, you're saying how you came across that number. So that's okay to put that together. And to also, there's a comment here about establishing a benchmark that also plays into that. So it's wonderful that when you've got a benchmark, now you can build on that year after year for a program or for a project or doing that assessment again. So nice ways to put all that together. And so I also want to note, so we're hitting the 10:30 mark, which is the end of our session. I will stay on to ask questions or take comments, but I want to just take a pause and say thank you for every single person who attended the webinar today. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was meaningful to you guys. Again, I think this is a start of a conversation. I've supplied a lot of information, mostly process-based to you, for then creating discrete outcomes of any one of these pieces that's put up on the screen here so that you can go forth with what's meaningful for you and your district and your program. I think there's going to be a lot of things that come out of this. If there's something specific you would like more information on that we can create follow-up webinars on this process, please put that into the chat box. I think there was already one about templates and how to create that. Can we do a short course webinar on that? If any one of these other processes in here you would like a more detailed webinar or information on, we can work on putting that together. Maybe it's one on how to establish clear goals and objectives. Literally, that is not easy as it sounds. That could be an hour-long webinar unto itself. So feel free, anything else you'd love for us to follow up on, we'd love to supply that for you through the CTD. So wearing two hats at the moment. As presenter, I'd love to help you. And as CTD, I know CTD would love to follow up and help you with some follow-up trainings or any other assessments that you need. And while we do questions and any other comments that come up, I'm going to put my contact information for my district up on the screen. You can contact me direct at any time. So with that, we can come back to questions and any other comments, anything folks want to share that's been valuable to them. Please put that in the questions box or raise your hand. We can unmute you and you can have a conversation about what's going on. So yeah, anything else that's popped into the questions box, Dan, that we can share or answer for questions?
Yeah, there was a question here. It says, we collect forest TA data, but the types of assistance vary a lot. How to create a metric from this data?
So I guess it's thinking through what's meaningful to you. So when you're thinking of the types of assistance vary a lot. So I assume this means, you know, an individual landowner phone call, a quick singular assessment on something, a full-blown plan. Track those things, right? So that's your category of type of assistance offered. And just make sure you have discrete descriptions of what that different type of TA assistance is so you can track that. So it's pretty easy for an individual to say like, oh, I did one out of these 4 things and go forward with that. So that's how I would do it, is if you're like, what you're tracking, your metric is type of assistance offered. And there it is. And then you can have a drop-down selection of between 1 and 27 things within there if that's what you're trying to collect on type of assistance offered. Hopefully that's a way to look at that.
Yeah. We also had a share in here from Ryan. He says, we also track number of plants and area treated for each BMP around the lake as well. QuickBase is the cloud-based database we use for tracking, and although it may not be cheap, it's simple to use, easily accessible, and customizable.
Yeah, so that's a great example of like a specific paid-for database that you can use. And again, that means that all staff in the office who have a license or use of that can input the data, and it's formatted, it's easy. You're working with it, let's say you're putting it in for a specific landowner or client, and then in the background, you can pull out or query a data set that pulls forward. So if you are lucky enough to be able to work with something like that, it does a lot of that work for you. You're just putting in metrics, and then later on, you can pull out a report from it. So again, you can go as simple as Excel, as complex as a paid-for database that does a lot of that work for you, which is really nice if you can afford that.
And there's a question in here, if preventing problems as opposed to correcting is the primary goal, making the case for your accomplishments can be difficult. Thoughts?
Preventing the problems. Wait, would you read that one to me one more time?
If preventing problems as opposed to correcting is the primary goal, then making the case for your accomplishments can be difficult.
True. Okay, so now we're in that area. Most likely you're preventing problems is going to be from education and outreach, right? So that's our primary methodology for communicating things out. And you're right, it's hard. So this is where you think through what are those metrics we should track. And this comes back a little bit to that estimating values part of it. So being thoughtful about, you know, the short and long term. And now you're making assumptions along with that to say, okay, this is how many landowners or individuals we did outreach for in these specific categories. And, you know, now we have to make an assumption. Could you get more detailed values? Sure, do surveys, right? A survey is a great way to test people's knowledge or thoughts before and after a process. If you have a survey that is the same things over a time period that people are willing to do, that is very discrete, measurable data over a time period that can have statistics assessed to it. That's pretty specific. So thinking that through along the way, do you just do the same survey at every single outreach event or to the same people? If you've got a database or listserv of emails, great. Otherwise, I get it. You're like, what's the impact of our website, right? Like, that's hard. So now you do have data in the background, analytics, how many people went to the page, how long were they there? And you make assumptions out of that. But your assumptions are based on your expertise. So I'm not just saying, oh yeah, people came to our page, I assume they did the right thing and everything's great. Instead, you say, okay, as an expert in the field or based on these things, we're assuming that if people come to our page, they're acquiring information that then they're hopefully outputting somewhere, or if they spend this time here and there. I'm not going to lie, like assessing that type of information and outreach data is very, very challenging when you don't have things that are really specific, like before and after surveys, or, you know, what is your change in knowledge on this, or what is your level of knowledge on that? So it can be very, very hard to capture that information, even as a planner. You know, if I go through the planning process with an individual and I'm on their farm, I know when I left, my qualitative assessment is their knowledge increased. I'm like, oh yeah, they were talking differently. They were saying things differently. They were communicating back to me the things I was trying to tell them. I know I made an impact. Man, how do I measure that? So perhaps you can create, again, based on internal processes, I give a rating. That's the metric that I track. It's a bit, subjective for me to say, I think there was, between a 1 and a 5 increase in their knowledge, 1 being none and 5 being extreme, like they want to join the district. I can say, I think there was a 2. I think there was a 4. So if I have a way to assess that, you can now create a measurable value for something that's really hard to measure. And then you can put that out at the end. Again, a Google review, what is that? Right? Like, you're assuming that people, 5-star means everyone loves it. But whether you get it and you hate it, you're like, what is wrong with everybody? So there is a lot of that we make assumptions for specific types of data. So it was probably a really long answer to that, except to say, I agree with you. It's not easy, but there are ways you can create metrics as long as you define how you did that. You write down how you did that, maybe talk to others and come together to say, how could we do that as a group? I highly encourage reaching out to other districts, people of your similar planning or level or whatever it may be, to come together to create something, and then be sure to share that out. When you create something awesome in a vacuum and no one knows about it, you're losing a lot of assistance we can put out as, kind of a family of districts for sharing that content and information. So any other questions that might have come in at this point, Jan? Again, I can stay on a little bit longer here and keep this up for folks, or if folks want to share anything that they would like to discuss with others or share anything else.
We do have one hand raised. Michael, I think you've had your hand raised for a little bit, so I'm not sure if we've already addressed the question, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And you probably need to unmute yourself as well if you want to ask your question there. Michael K.
Yeah, so Michael, if you want, if it's still relevant, feel free to, we've unmuted you. You can unmute yourself if you want to ask your question or share something.
Yeah, in the meantime, just looking at the box there, I think we just have a lot of appreciation for tackling this subject and going over these things, especially there's a comment here about with the outreach data discussions, super difficult to kind of pin that down. So, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, if that's everything, we can officially close down the webinar. I will again thank those who stuck around to hear more. And again, as you can hear, this is big. And if you have more specific questions, you can contact me. I'm happy to help process through that. Contact other districts. There are different groups out there that perhaps can come together in a discipline to think through questions and valuable ways to approach that. Ways to come up with useful metrics across the board, things that we can collect and have that can be very simple once again. For collecting those, some are more complex. So if anything, I hope that you're a little bit aligned to a bigger thoughtful process of where you as an individual sit in that, where you as a whole, thinking through the whole, whether it's dictated to you or you are creating that process of how to select and evaluate your metrics. I hope this webinar was helpful to you. Perhaps we'll have some follow-ups on some of the more discrete parts of that process and bringing those forward. But otherwise, happy holidays to everybody. Stay safe and sane out there. Take care, and we'll see you next month for our January webinar where we start a whole new year. So thank you all. Take care.